The envelope slid under the lamp's cone of light and stopped, as if it had weight beyond paper. Inside the glass and steel silence of his corner office, Lucas Mendonça watched it unfold like a private interruption. It was crumpled, folds made by a small, determined hand, and the handwriting looped with the blunt, hopeful certainty only children have. He read the first line aloud to the empty room, because the words sounded like a dare and like a plea at once. "Dear Santa, please send me a dad who stays." The rest of the paper held little drawings: a stick-figure family, a crooked house with smoke curling from the chimney, and a star pinned to the sky. A child's dot of red ink tried to color the heart beside the words. There was no return address, no class stamp, only a faint smudge of glitter along the fold. His first reaction was practical. Someone had slipped this through the reception, an oddity, a human touch among calendars and brand brochures. He scanned to the bottom for a signature, a teacher's name, any clue. Nothing. Then the other reaction unspooled, a small, aching fissure in the armor he had built over the years. He had engineered systems that moved millions, but no algorithm could translate the bluntness of that single line into anything he was prepared for. He set the letter on the polished mahogany and looked up at the city. Sao Paulo's winter sky outside the tower was a flat, silver sheet. Ibirapuera Park's plane trees etched dark against it. The office lights were too bright for the hour, bathing executive furniture in a glare that made everything look designed to avoid intimacy. Lucas had long ago learned the language of distance: controlled meetings, measured phrases, and a calendar that never left room for surprise. Now surprise had arrived in the shape of a child's wish. He should have put it in a drawer with the other curiosities that drifted through his day: lost invitations, charity appeals, the occasional anonymous fan letter. Instead, he pinched the paper and felt the weight of someone else's small life pressing faintly through it. He could imagine the child pressing the paper into an envelope at her kitchen table, a lamp humming, the radio playing a Christmas song haltingly in the background. He could imagine the mother, tired, proud, watching her daughter fold the edges with the care of a ritual. He thought of his own history in a country house outside the city, of waiting rooms and departures. The memory that rose first was always the same: a small boy in a coat too thin for winter, standing at an airport window, pressing his face to the glass while the sky took his father away. The man who had left not a country, but an absence that grew like ivy through Lucas's life. He had become, by habit more than decision, a man who delivered things and avoided the work of staying. The letter on his desk had no signature, but it had a geography in its handwriting: the angle of certain letters, the way the S looped like a hook, the tendency to draw oversized eyes in stick figures. He could not, rationally, trace a child's pen to a neighborhood. He was not a detective. He was a man used to solving problems with teams and data, not with tenderness. Yet the letter refused to let him retreat into spreadsheets. Claudia found him still at his desk 2 nights later, the city long since retreated into a low, steady hum. She carried a thermos of coffee and something that looked like obligation in her eyes, the expression of someone who had been in the middle of too many things at once for too long. Lucas liked that about Claudia. She moved through the company's cogs with the same steadiness she used to fix things in her sister's apartment, and she never let him forget the human part of any equation. "You read it?" she asked without preamble. She set the thermos down, took the envelope from his hand, smoothed it between her fingers like a learned reasoner examining a clue. "Yes," Lucas said. "Do you know whose it is?" Claudia's face softened the way it did when she looked at family photographs on her phone. "Helena's," she said. The name alone was a small private explication for both of them. Claudia had been with the company long enough to know Lucas's inventory of compartmentalized life, what he allowed into it and what he kept at bay. She also happened to be Helena's aunt and Marina's younger sister. It was one of those connections that sounded obvious once you learned it, the assistant with a sister in a neighborhood 2 subway lines away, the executive in a tower whose best-laid strategies didn't include being the answer to a child's prayer. Claudia watched him while he processed. She handed it in at school last week, she said. The teacher kept it in a box of other letters, thinking they'd do some project with them. It didn't mean anything to them, just part of the holiday craft. Lucas pictured the box, hands of 21st graders dropping folded secrets into a container, the teacher's warm, distracted voice organizing activities. He pictured, too, Helena's hand closing over the paper, deliberate, hopeful. He felt oddly defensive of the child's wish, as if the corporate world had no right to it. He should have been satisfied with the human mischief of it. Instead, something closer to compulsion took hold. "How did it get here?" he asked. Claudia's mouth twitched. "I put it here." Her simplicity in the admission was a small, intimate betrayal. How?" "I found it when I picked Helena up from my sister's place. I thought it was a company charity, kids writing to us. I suppose I thought it would be nice to read it to you." She shrugged, a gesture that suggested both guilt and a certain proud calculation. She had long seen Lucas as more than boss, a man with less armor than he would admit, and a softness that showed when the right human math aligned. Lucas felt the prick of conscience. The letter had not arrived by chance. He had been given it. The ethical perimeter tightened. He should have set it aside. He should have done the administrative thing, return it, mention it at the next staff meeting, file it away as a human interest anecdote for the company newsletter. Instead, he felt the old mechanism, the compulsion to act, turn over and over in his chest. He wanted to know who Helena was, what it meant to ask for a dad who stays, and whether there was a pattern he recognized. He wanted to trace how such longing could be condensed into 5 words and a star drawn with too much glare. "Bring Helena and Marina here," he heard himself say, and the sentence surprised him. It was a corporate imperative softened into a personal one. Claudia blinked. She looked at him the way someone studies a weather forecast that suddenly calls for snow in a city that rarely expects it. "We shouldn't," she said. "Marina is protective. She doesn't take favors well. You know that." Lucas did know that. He could picture Marina's apartment, the curtains hemmed after many washings, a kitchen table peppered with schoolbooks and receipts, a calendar that governed an entire household. He could see the cautious tilt of her jaw in a photograph Claudia had once shown him, when she had introduced Marina as the woman who never depends on pity. The word pride came to mind, and then respect. Claudia folded her hands, the manner of someone containing a push against an old friend. "I thought of arranging something like a corporate visit, a CSR thing, a charity pitch. That way they won't feel singled out, and if Marina says no, it's not personal." Her voice held a plan, the kind she'd learned at her sister's tiny kitchen table. Solve the problem without making it a spectacle. Lucas felt a familiar hum of corporate ease at the idea. Charity was the language that softened introductions between different worlds. But another part of him recoiled at the notion of his interest masquerading as corporate obligation. There was a dissonance in pretending, in the small deception that could be justified as kindness. He thought of all the times he had doctored facts in boardrooms for the sake of good optics. Those had been safe. This felt different because it involved a child's trust. "Tell Marina the truth," he said. His voice surprised him with its steadiness. "Tell her you brought me because I read the letter and asked, because it moved me. If she wants to refuse, she'll refuse. If she wants conditions, she'll set them. No CSR pretense." Claudia looked at him the same way she had looked at a project he had once insisted on canceling mid-flight. She weighed the personal against the practical. "She will be suspicious," she said. "She'll ask why you care, and she will test you." He almost laughed at the thought. Testing was a ritual his childhood had made him expect. For once, he did not want to fail it through stealth. "Then let her test me," he said. When he met Marina at the school gym, the lights were warm, and the smell of coffee and fried dough from a nearby stall wound through the air. Children in paper crowns practiced lines under the supervision of teachers with tired, patient smiles. The gym's holiday decorations looked handmade, construction paper stars and garlands, everything touched by hands that had more care than resources. Marina stood near the back, a figure of contained motion. She wore a coat that was practical rather than showy. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot that kept practicality and pride in tidy coexistence. Her eyes assessed Lucas with the same economy of movement with which she handled life: quick, effective, unyielding. Claudia introduced them formally, the small introductions of family folding into professional courtesy. "Lucas Mendonça," Claudia said. "He works downtown." She gave Marina the short version of his name as if that might smooth the first impression. Marina thanked her and extended a hand to Lucas like a closing of a contract. Lucas felt self-conscious. In a room where most hands held paper crowns or painted stars, his hand felt too expensive. He could feel the invisible ledger of assumptions, wealth, power, motives, tilting the air between them. He wanted to say the right thing, that the letter had found him, not the other way around, that his curiosity was not a threat, that he did not believe charity ended in checks. But such sentences can sound performative in a gym full of children waiting for snacks. Instead, he said simply, "Thank you for letting me come." Marina's reply was a measured nod. "You are Claudia's boss," she said. Her voice contained an immediate, practical question. What did this mean for me and my child? The question had a protective edge. It was not malicious, only pragmatic. "She told me you read a letter," Marina continued. "I thought it was charity. That's why I'm here. If you are here, what do you want?" The bluntness of her question was a boundary, and Lucas acknowledged it as if it were an invitation. "I read a child's letter," he said. "I wanted to meet the people behind it. Nothing more. I am not here to fix anything for money. I'm just interested in knowing why a child would write that." For a thin moment, Marina's posture shifted. She had rehearsed responses for everything, for the pitying glances at the grocery store, for the loan requests from neighbors, for the well-meaning hand extended with a hidden ledger. This looked like one of those moments where charity could be tested, and she was not willing to be reduced to a narrative. She's not a charity case," Marina said. "We get by. We have our rhythms. If you want to know someone, you don't announce it and expect them to be grateful." Claudia, who had been at Marina's shoulder like a slow, steady tide, put a hand on her sister's arm. "I told her I would introduce you if you really wanted to meet them," she said, "but I told her you'd have to accept conditions. No money offered like a solution, no proclamations. You come, you listen, you leave if she says leave." Lucas found himself saying, "Agreed." The ease with which she pledged presence surprised him. It was a small vow, but the act of making it public made it weighty. Helena appeared at that moment, practical and immediate in the way children are. Hair tied in two brisk ponytails, a slight smudge of glue on her thumb, eyes like small weather stations, honest gauges for warmth and falsity. She hopped in with the energy of someone who had a place to be, but also an eye for novelty. "Are you Santa?" she asked Lucas without preamble, because children go straight to the axis of questioning that matters. She looked him up and down with the thin mercy of a jury that is not yet tired. She had the freedom to accept or decline him from the start. Lucas wasn't Santa, and he wasn't pretending to be. "No," he said, "but I read a letter that sounded like it had been written to Santa." Helena's brows knitted. "Is Santa still in the North Pole?" she asked, more concerned about geography than the metaphysics of miracles. "Because my house isn't warm, and the North Pole has snow." "He's fine in the North Pole," Lucas said, compensating with a courtesy he had been taught at dinner tables where feelings were not spoken directly. "Sometimes people write him when they want help, like asking for someone to stay with them." She considered his answer like a small arithmetic problem, then smiled with the blunt logic of a child. "Well, you can stay then. Just be home when I wake up." It was the sort of sentence literature made a home of, a child's clarity uncluttered by adult hesitation. Lucas felt a quiet laugh bubble up, embarrassed and tender. He found himself agreeing, not as a contractual promise, but as an opening. "I'll do my best," he said. Marina watched the exchange with something like a pivot. She had 1,000 reasons to assume this was an interlude, a curious man playing at benevolence on the periphery of her life. But there was also the way he had listened, how he had not attempted to sort their difficulties into solutions exhibited like products. He had offered no checkbook, no sweeping promise, no platform. He had offered a small, verifiable thing instead: attention. By the time Helena's class began performing, little nativity scenes and a song about winter that none of the children quite understood the literalities of, the shape of the meeting had changed. Lucas found himself laughing with the other parents in awkward synchrony, his laughter hypocritical at first, but then warming like a hand to a cold cup. He watched Marina hold Helena's hand as the child improvised her lines, and he saw not need, but competency. A mother who had worked countless small miracles and kept a place of dignity for them both. After the show, Marina walked with them to a small bakery across the street. The winter was the kind of Sao Paulo winter that was more damp than cold, designed to get under your collar and linger. Steam from the bakery steamed in a small, fragrant column that smelled of cinnamon and yeast. Helena insisted on a chocolate roll and chewed it with a focus that made the scene domestic, ordinary, in a way that made it precious. Claudia and Lucas took up a corner table where the lighting was softer and human. Claudia, who had always been a private person with the bulldozer efficiency of an organizer, took a breath and set down the terms she felt she needed to say aloud in order for this to work. "Marina," she began, looking at her sister with that rough affection only siblings have, "I didn't bring him as a thing. I told him the truth. He wanted to meet you because of the letter." Marina's eyes froze with caution. "Then there's nothing to say," she replied. "We don't need charity. We don't need a project. If a man wants to be in our lives, he'll be in them without needing an audience." Lucas felt the sting of the remark as if it were intended directly for him. It was, in part, and he welcomed it. He had no interest in an audience. He had an interest in the slow, unglamorous labor of being present. He wanted to prove that in ways not visible on a press release. "Understand something," he said carefully. "I don't want to impose. I know what it looks like for a stranger to show up and say everything will be fine. I'm not going to pretend I can fix things with money or with a flashy announcement. If you allow me in, it will be on your terms, and if you want me gone, I'll leave." Marina studied him, as if measuring the metal of his words. Then she set 3 conditions, each one precise. "You meet us without cameras. No interviews, no statements to the press. You come when you say you'll come. If we say leave, you leave. Third, no gifts as apology. If you bring something, make it thoughtful, not a spectacle." Lucas felt an odd relief at the strictness. It made a measurable contract out of vagueness. "Agreed," he said. He meant it. It was a promise that would look small in the ledger of his life, but would grow in weight the more often he kept it. Helena, who had been swinging her legs under the cafe table, looked at him with an expression of final judgment and declared, "You can come to my house, but you have to bring pancakes." Pancakes. The specificity of the request sidestepped all the dramatic abstractions and landed in the realm of the doable. Lucas had never made pancakes for anyone he had to persuade to stay. He had had breakfasts with investors and occasional corporate brunches. Pancakes were domestic. They required fumbling and time, and, for him, the endurance to be present at a small kitchen table without answering to a calendar. He found himself saying, "I'll learn how to make them." Claudia smiled at him, not because he had declared anything dramatic, but because he had agreed to something with no immediate leverage attached. Marina, who had experienced grand promises before, allowed herself a small skeptical smile. It was not an admission of trust, it was an acknowledgement of terms being put into place. Lucas remembered leaving the bakery that evening with the letter folded into his coat pocket like a sacred relic. It hummed against his ribs with the warmth of a thing that would not be ignored. The city around him glittered in the modest way of a place that carries many domestic urgencies at once. Families walked in small groups. Men argued about club games. A street vendor sold roasted chestnuts. The world marched on with its complex indifference. He went home and ordered a book on pancakes out of something like ritual. It arrived 2 days later, a small hardcover with photos of butter melting into rounded batter. He read recipes as if they were code and practiced once awkwardly in his well-appointed kitchen. He burned the first batch, but laughed at himself in solitude. The burn felt like an honest mistake, not a masquerade. The early days thereafter were a study in consistency. Lucas came when he said he would. He appeared at the park with Helena after school, the child running ahead with the right mixtures of abandon and check. He learned her small rhythms, the way she ran her finger along the railing when she was thinking, the habit of tucking her chin into her scarf on a windy day, the list she kept in her head of things she wanted to learn, how to count stars, how to tie shoes, how to make the best paper boat. He brought paper, he brought attention, he brought questions and kept them simple. Marina watched cautiously. She noticed the small things he failed to do, like answering calls during dinner, and then the small things he learned to do better, silencing his phone when they were together, bending down to tie Helena's shoelaces, staying until homework was completed. Sometimes he spoke frankly, offering the kind of short admissions that sounded unpolished and therefore honest. "I grew up with a man who left," he told Marina once, the two of them standing at the sink in her tiny kitchen as she washed the plates and he dried them. "I avoided being that man by being absent in other ways. I'm trying to be different." Marina gave a small, guarded laugh. "Trying is the minimum," she said. Her voice was not a dismissal, more a test. "We don't need perfection. We need consistency." "Then I'll be consistent," he said. Those words, repeated in small acts, began to stitch a seam. He turned down a last-minute evening flight to be home to make pancakes for Helena's school breakfast. He sat on the floor and built a wobbly paper boat with her instead of leaving for a client dinner. He visited a bookstore with her and bought a cheap astronomy book she wanted with the money he'd saved on a lunch he had canceled. When he did give money, rarely and unwitnessed, it was for things that solved measurable daily inconveniences: fixing the leaky faucet at Marina's sink, covering a school trip fee so Helena could join her classmates. Even then, he insisted on privacy. It was not meant as a spectacle or a quick repair to the relationship's structure. He had learned early that money could open doors, but could not hold them. From his perspective, there was another landscape being rebuilt at the same time, the inside terrain of his own mind. On late nights, when the city's windows lit like a field of distant fires, he would replay his father's absences and his own responses. He had spent a fortune learning to keep a company afloat. He had spent less time learning how to let a person anchor him. He understood his fear now, the precise way being present meant surrendering to repetition, to the boringness of daily care, to the small acts that, over time, accumulate into trust. Yet trust was also fragile. An incident pushed that fragility into view. One evening, Lucas was at a board meeting when his phone buzzed, a terse message from Claudia. They needed him at a school function. Helena had been invited to receive a small award, and Marina was worried about the logistics. Lucas excused himself and promised to be there. Midway through the meeting, a client called with a crisis about a deployment bug, the kind of technical emergency that made investors' brows furrow and could cascade into hundreds of lost users if not contained immediately. Rodrigo's voice on the line was brisk and familiar. "We can push a hotfix now, or we can risk a cascade and investors will panic." Lucas felt the old vector reflex: solve, deploy, control. It was the language his company spoke, a quick surgery for a bleeding algorithm. He could, in an hour, restore a system's health, and in an hour win the gratitude of stakeholders. He could make his absence a public good. He thought of the gym lights, Marina's measured condition, Helena's small face expectant with a child's award waiting to be celebrated. He thought of the promise he had quietly given at a bakery, to learn pancakes, to be consistent, to stay when expected. He felt the weight of a choice shaped like a seesaw, a man who built companies versus a man learning to be part of a family. He left the meeting shaking off the boardroom's urgency and took the elevator to the street. The city felt different that evening. The sky pressed low and gray. Steam rose from manhole covers like little exhalations. He texted Rodrigo 5 words, "Fix it, I can't leave." Rodrigo's reply was a single punctuation, an exclamation mark, and a thumb emoji. It wasn't an answer. It was a reaction to something he didn't fully understand, the unfamiliar geometry of someone's priorities changing. When Lucas turned his phone back off, a new wave of trepidation rose. He had made a choice, and the universe was patient for the consequences. He also understood that a single decision did not build trust, it only sustained it for one evening. Trust required accumulation. He had chosen, but he could not yet know whether his choice would read in Marina's mind as a promise kept or a fluke. He found them in the schoolyard under a tent that smelled of candy floss and paper. Helena held a small certificate, a bent edge at the corner like it had already been loved. She ran to him as he approached, and at that small motion, something in Lucas unclenched. He crouched down to her level, and she gave him the sort of endorsement only children can. An uncalculated hug, a warm, quick bond pressed to his chest. Marina watched, and her face remained cautious. She did not demonstrate consternation outwardly, rather, she catalogued and filed. "You were missed at the meeting," she said. There was no scorn, only the curious ledger of evidence she kept. "I know," Lucas said. He felt the tightrope of his earlier decision become palpable. "I had to choose." Marina regarded him with something like an appraisal. His choice, his explanation, his face. "You chose to be here." "Yes," he said. The word sat like a small flag. There was no grand transfiguration in that moment, no cinematic reconnection, and yet it was a turning. Helena tugged his hand toward a stall where someone was giving away paper crowns. Lucas allowed himself to be dragged into the small domesticity. For once, he didn't think about leverage or optics. He was simply a man with sticky fingers from candy floss, a child laughing at him, and a woman watching the way he moved within the small domestic orbit of her family. The warm, soft glow of the tent lights made the scene look like an old photograph. Lucas let the moment rest in him. Consistency felt possible, but consistency also required vigilance. That night, climbing into his apartment, he felt an echo of his father's last long absence. There would be nights of vacancy, he understood, nights when the old reflex to close himself up would rise. He imagined a future of many small rituals, and alongside it, the risk of failure. He had not yet earned their trust. He could only continue. He had to learn to be predictable without controlling, to be present without suffocating, to accept rejection and remain. He had the whole of it to learn, starting with pancakes and a dozen trips to the park. He would stumble, he would apologize, he would persist. And then, 2 days after the school fair, during an ordinary Thursday afternoon that smelled of printer ink and cold coffee, his phone buzzed with a message that was all capitals from Rodrigo. "Massive investor interest. Board call tonight. Be ready. Huge." Lucas paused, his hand on the phone, the letter tucked in his desk at home like a warm, insistent ember. He looked at the message and then at the window where São Paulo moved its slow, indifferent mass below. In the bakery of his memory, Helena had said, "Just be home when I wake up." That line had lodged in him like a promise and like a test. He sat down at his kitchen counter, the city's winter settling like a shawl on his shoulders. And he felt the old impulse to do the extraordinary, to call Rodrigo back and say yes, to fly into another emergency that would end in applause. He also felt a fresh, foreign tug, to decline, to explain, to sit with Marina and Helena and bake a practice batch of pancakes for no reason other than the work of staying. The choice, in that silence, seemed to stretch into a future he had not yet earned. He swallowed and looked at the letter again. The child's star shimmered faintly from an old smear of glitter. The letter could not be his roadmap, but it could be a mirror. He typed a reply to Rodrigo, "Give me 2 hours." And as he pressed send, the low hum of the city seemed to answer with the knowledge that nothing of value would be decided on a single evening, but that everything would be decided in the accumulation of small acts. He sent the reply, and the red cursor blinked like an accusation. "Give me 2 hours." He watched the message go, feeling the small nervous tremor of a man who had just altered the geometry of his day. He did not hover in the lobby or pace in the elevator. He went home, because there are decisions best prepared for by rituals you cannot outsource. In his apartment, he found the letter again, folded in a neat rectangle now, its creases worn soft where his thumb had traced the child's loops until the ink blurred like a memory. He made coffee, not as a strategy, but as a way to keep his hands busy and his mind from leaping back toward the familiar safety of numbers and forecasts. 2 hours became an island where he had to remember how to be ordinary. He watched a short tutorial on pancakes, not because he thought recipes could make him tender, but because small competence is the grammar of intimacy. He practiced the flip once, awkwardly, more theatrical than successful. Batter stuck to his pan. Butter smoked. He laughed at himself, imagining Helena's verdict. He packed a small carrier with a thermos of hot chocolate and the practice pancake that had survived his attempt, wrapped in a napkin and slightly singed at the edge. It felt ridiculous and fiercely honest. When he arrived at Marina's building, the concierge recognized him and allowed the elevator without comment. The neighborhood had tightened into an evening rhythm. A barbershop closing its shutters, a light spilling from a late-shift bakery, someone dragging a mattress to a truck. The walk from the elevator to Marina's door took him past the stairwell when neighborhood flyers fought for space with lost pet posters. The smallness of these things steadied him. Helena opened the door before he could knock, as if she had kept watch at the eye of a lighthouse. She held the thermos like a trophy, her face flushed from the day's school air. "Pancakes?" she asked, as if the world consisted of pancakes and justice. "Kind of," he admitted. "Practice pancakes." She regarded his offering like an inspector of miracles. "They look a little sad," she said, then, with the blunt mercy of a child, added, "But my mom says trying is important, so we'll try them." In the kitchen, Marina watched him from the sink where she had been rinsing a pan. Water ran like the steady background music of a home. She met his eyes without pomp. "You have 2 hours," she said. "Make them edible." His first meals with Helena were awkward and perfect in the way beginnings often are. He learned to judge heat by sound, to wait for the batter's bubbles before the flip. Helena explained the important things in life between mouthfuls, the correct way to fold a paper boat, not too much pressure at the nose, which constellations looked most like animals, which side of the chocolate roll was better to start on. Marina watched him make mistakes, over salty batter once, a burnt edge. She corrected him with a calm voice that made the corrections feel like useful instruction rather than humiliation. After the pancakes, when Helena had declared them not bad for a beginner, Marina sat across from Lucas at her small table and asked a question she had kept folded in the seam of her ribs. "Why do you want to be here?" she said. It was the simplest test, motive distilled to words. He could have said many things, offered analyses of longing and remedies for loneliness. Instead, he told a story no longer than the truth. "I read a letter," he said, "a small letter. It felt like a responsibility, not a problem. I don't think I can fix everything, but I can come when I say I will. And I want to learn the things that matter. Pancakes, paper boats, names of stars. Those things matter." Marina's shoulders lowered slightly. It was not surrender, but the beginning of calculation. "Actions matter," she said. "Words are cheap." "Then judge me by my pancakes," he answered. They both laughed, an exchange that felt like the settling of new furniture into a room. Over the next weeks, "Judge me by my pancakes" became a running, gentle joke. Lucas kept appointments, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with an awkwardness that had the sheen of sincerity. He appeared for school plays, for doctor appointments, for the small victories that make up the ledger of a life. A good grade, a skinned knee comforted without dramatics, a bandage applied straight. He learned to iron a collared shirt, not for show, but because Helena liked the smooth feel of cotton when she tucked it into a backpack for a family picture. He spent an afternoon fixing the leaky faucet in Marina's kitchen, sitting on the floor with a flashlight and a ratchet, small grease staining his sleeve like an honest badge. He hired a plumber only when it was clear the problem needed expertise, then paid without ceremonious receipts because the work mattered and Marina's dignity mattered more. All along, there were at least two practical worlds overlapping him: the quiet domestic cluster of pancakes, paper boats, and patching guilt wounds, and the pulsing, infinite world of his company. Rodrigo called sometimes with the cadence of a brother who had weathered every corporate campaign with him. Claudia filtered things like a good riverbank, holding back the worst of the flow and letting the rest through. She texted sparse updates, board stable, no press, or the occasional warning, investor dinner moved up. When his calendar threatened to constrict into old habits, Lucas learned to speak about it plainly. He told Marina when a board call would spill over, and he asked permission to reschedule if it meant breaking a promise to Helena. He was not perfect at it. There were moments of forgetting, of answering a call when his mouth should have been full of pancakes. Each time, he apologized without theatrically and tried again. Yet trust did not grow in a straight line. It is a rope woven of many tiny choices, and sometimes the rope frays. The first true test came from outside their quiet household, a rumor, small as a rumor must be to travel, but significant enough to prick Marina's skin. A parent at school, who liked to arrange life into stories, had seen Lucas at a photocopy shop near the school with a glossy brochure. He had made talk of Lucas organizing a corporate donation, and the rumor slid like oil under the neighborhood's doors. It did not take long for a whispered version to reach Marina. They're getting help from a rich guy. Why would he be interested? Publicity, perhaps? Words have a craft of their own. They can be shaped into praise or turned into a weapon. Marina did not ask Claudia about the rumor. She waited, cataloging, letting the rumor sit like a grain of salt suspended in soup. When she finally spoke to Lucas, her tone was not accusation, but an inquiry shaped by fatigue. "It seems there are stories," she said quietly one evening as they picked up Helena from a school rehearsal. "People think you're doing this for PR or for charity optics." Lucas felt the small hand of panic at the back of his throat, the one he had felt when the boardroom had called and he had chosen a school award instead. "Who said that?" he asked, but his voice carried the wrong music, defensive. "Someone saw you with a brochure," Marina said. "They said you were choosing a program to sponsor. They didn't know anything, but the idea is out there." He should have been able to dissolve the notion with a single, unambiguous statement. "I told Claudia the truth. She told your sister. There was no pretense." He should have known that clarity is a balm. But Claudia's earlier act, bringing the letter and placing it on his desk, had been an informal, well-meaning intrusion into other people's lives. It had been honest, but it had also been a maneuver, a human shortcut. Claudia meant to create an opening, to nudge something loose. She had not considered how rumor could entangle itself with good intentions. Marina's trust did not fracture on the idea alone. It fractured when she wondered whether they had been chosen as a story, a touchpoint, an experiment. Lucas looked at Marina and tried to set out the sequence he had kept private. "Claudia told me where the letter came from," he said. "She told me because she thought it would matter to me. She didn't think of it as charity. She thought it might be something I wanted to know." Marina considered him, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate that honesty," she said, but there was a distance in her voice now that was new. "But you have to understand why we would be wary. We've been shown kindness before in a form that felt like leverage. People come in with cameras and checkbooks, and the stories get told and sold. I don't want that for us." He understood. He had more than once used PR to cushion his business moves. He had seen how narratives could be manufactured. how human beings could be reduced to before and after photographs for brand campaigns. The thought made his skin prickle. "Then I will do one thing," he said. "I will be transparent. No cameras, no press conferences, no staged photos. If Claudia or anyone else talks about this to the press, I will ask them to stop. This will be ours to tell if and when we want to." Marina's eyes searched his. "And if people assume without asking, then we explain," he said. "We tell the truth. You met me because of a letter. You allowed me to be part of your lives on your terms. That's all." They left it there, but the rumor had planted a doubt that would be hard to pull out. For a week, Marina watched how Lucas handled small social moments. Did he steer them to exhibition? Did he hint at how generous he could be? He was careful. Yet the neighborhood's murmurs are patient things. They listen for mistakes. The second and deeper fracture came when Claudia, in a moment of misplaced zeal, spoke to a columnist. She had thought she was protecting Lucas from the spotlight by suggesting a human interest piece to soften any press that might try to take liberties. She had not thought of the way the idea would feel like a violation. When Marina heard that someone had suggested a feature story, she felt the sting of being curated. She called Claudia and asked bluntly why she had done it. Claudia, who had always been a woman of busy hands and a protective instinct, received Marina's fury with embarrassment, and then with a humility that surprised even herself. "I thought I was helping," she said. "I'm sorry, I did not see how it might look." "I only wanted to make sure you wouldn't feel surprised if someone else came." Marina's voice on the phone trembled slightly, the kind of tremor that comes from being too long vigilant. "We did not agree to become a story, Claudia. We agreed to something else." Claudia's apology was earnest. She came up to Marina's apartment, carrying a bag of groceries, as if to put bread to the idea she had endangered. She sat down and explained how she had imagined the story, allowing them to tell their own context rather than being tokenized. "I was trying to control the narrative," she said. "I thought I could protect you by shaping the story first." What Claudia failed to understand was that control is not always protection. Control is a kind of erasure. Marina's life had been one of constructing dignity within scarcity. She allowed help when it was honest and when it did not become currency. Claudia had made a move without consent. She had assumed a narrative, and that presumption had cut. Lucas, when he learned about the misstep, went to Marina's apartment and stood in the doorway while she and Claudia talked. He felt a hot, unfamiliar humility at the edges of his corporate confidence. Words were insufficient now. He sat down and said, "I didn't know. I would have stopped it if I'd known. I want to make this right." Marina looked at him like someone measuring the weight of an unknown coin. "How do you make right something that cuts into what we agreed was ours?" she asked. He had no immediate answer. What he did have was a ledger of actions he could offer. He could fire PR people who tried to shape their lives for headlines. He could ask Claudia to step back from any public-facing moves. He could sign an agreement of privacy if that meant creating a formality that had teeth. He could ask Rodrigo, if necessary, to keep the company's people from using this as content. But he knew something else. None of that would heal the immediate cut. Healing required proximity, not policies. It required him to be present in ways that were visible and actionable to Marina, not to anyone else. He knelt in front of her, one day when Helena was at school and Claudia had slipped out to give her sister space. "I will not let my world take you," he said. "I will not let our story be a commodity. If you want, I will resign from any public-facing idea that involves you. I will promise never to speak to the press about this family. I will ask Claudia to keep this private and to apologize publicly to you. But mostly, I'll keep showing up. I'll keep being small and consistent." Marina watched him, then sighed, not from defeat, but from the weariness of someone who had been forced into endless assessments. "Actions," she said again. "You must prove it." Claudia apologized to Marina with a frankness that recognized the breach.
She admitted her error without defense. "I wanted to do something that felt like I was protecting my sister," she said. "I should have asked. I'm sorry."
Over time, those apologies mattered because they were followed by behavior. Claudia stepped back. She set boundaries with her colleagues and told them explicitly to respect privacy. Rodrigo, who had been brusque in a text the night Lucas chose pancakes over a board meeting, called and said something that surprised Lucas with its softness. "I don't get it," Rodrigo said, "but I respect that you do. Walk your own path." There was still friction. Trust, when it has been scuffed, takes time to be buffed smooth. There were evenings when Marina stayed later at work because a parent needed help, and Lucas, who had promised to be present, sat at home waiting and wondered if the promises he made had weight or if they were merely brittle ornaments. Helena sometimes asked questions with a child's bluntness that required honesty. "Why did you read my letter?" she asked once as they walked home through the park. "Because it sounded important," he said, "and because some things are important even when we're not sure why." She considered him with the slow light of a thinking child. "My dad left," she said, as if offering up a fact in geography. "He says sometimes he'll come back and sometimes he doesn't. I told Santa because I didn't know what else to do. You came." He felt an immovable tenderness at the way she announced the facts of abandonment as if they were a child's homework. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm not going to be another someone who says they'll come back and doesn't." Her small hand found his, and the city seemed to hush around them. Presence accumulates in those hands. Winter moved on, and with it, the scales that once measured Lucas's days began to tilt. The company had a period of stability. Investors called their praise and then went quiet. He had chosen to be off a board call and had not been publicly punished for it. He had also faced practical consequences. An important meeting slipped his attention, an opportunity for favorable press evaporated. Instead, he had pancakes that tasted of patient practice, and a girl's laughter that had found a home in his chest. Then came the crisis that would force a larger reckoning. It arrived in a way that only modern life knows. A small misconfiguration in a server environment that cascaded into an outage affecting a handful of high-profile clients. Inside the company, alarms were literal. Red dashboards, urgent messages, investors' eyebrows arched. Rodrigo sent an immediate message: "We need you." Lucas read it and felt the old urge to run to the controls. He understood, in a way that no one else did, that some problems required his particular mind. He also understood that running would require a night away from Helena, who had asked for him to attend a small school concert and then to stay for a homemade Christmas dinner at Marina's. He called Rodrigo and listened to the outline of the crisis, the technical options laid plain across the phone like surgical diagrams. "I can guide you through a rollback," he said finally, "but I need you on site for the first push. I can take it over in 2 hours if you can hold." Rodrigo's voice had the tired stiffness of someone who had watched men choose work over home for years. "We don't have 2 hours," he said. "If we lose these clients, it's not just money, it's momentum. You said you were committed to being here. If you're not here when it matters, people will assume why." Lucas felt the old binary closing in: work or home, career or family. He had chosen small things so far. This choice bore a different heft. He thought of the multiplied benefits of saving a company pivot: jobs preserved, confidence restored. He also thought of Helena's eyes when she had whispered, "Just be home when I wake up." The words were not commandments. They were a child's attempt to calcify hope into a simple metric. He chose again. He told Rodrigo to hold and gave him instructions he trusted would be followed by the engineers. He called one of his senior directors and walked him through the immediate rollback, leaving clear points of escalation. He put the phone in his pocket and drove to Marina's. He had not pretended the decision would be free of consequence at work. He had only decided that certain things had priority he had not given them before. That evening at the school concert was small and imperfect. Helena missed a cue. Lucas clapped loud enough to drown shame. Afterwards, they walked, hand in hand, to Marina's apartment, where a dinner had been prepared with the kind of measured frugality that is an art. Marina's neighbors had contributed a roasted chicken, a bowl of rice, a salad. The table was set with mismatched plates and a small candle. The light warmed faces that had endured seasons. Rodrigo texted during the concert. "Server's stable for now. Good call." It arrived like a permission slip. He smiled at the message, but he did not read it aloud. The choosing felt private now. The weeks that followed were neither miraculous nor tidy. They were a steady practice of the ordinary. Lucas helping with homework, Marina returning favors in ways that were invisible to outside eyes. She arranged a visit from a tutor for a child in Helena's class. She fixed Lucas's shirt that had a stubborn button. She taught Helena the delicate art of making coffee for guests. There were small fights, about a phone answered at dinner, about a comment taken as flattery that felt like a showcase, but they were resolved with a new pattern: immediate acknowledgement and repair. Spring came, though in Sao Paulo, spring is a suggestion at first. Jacaranda blooms like purple confetti on sidewalks, the air shifts, and a smell of damp leaves comes from the park. Helena started gymnastics classes, Lucas learned to tie a double knot in shoelaces and to sit through a long recital without checking his watch. He began to find that being present at small rituals anchored him in a way nothing else had. The rhythm of making pancakes on Saturday mornings, of folding paper boats on rainy afternoons, of asking Helena about her drawings, gave him a life that felt honest and worth guarding. Claudia found a new role in all this. She became a careful keeper of boundaries, the person who would step in to ensure no journalist knocked on Marina's door. She also re-entered the picture as a sister who had to negotiate the nudges of family and the rigors of corporate life. Once, after a long day of sorting invoices and school supplies, she sat on Marina's couch and confessed a quiet fear. "I was terrified I'd lose you for reasons I couldn't control," she admitted. "I thought if Lucas's kindness became part of a story, it would be different. I didn't think about how that would make you feel." Marina, who had softened but not dissolved her careful walls, put her hand over Claudia's. "Thank you for apologizing," she said. "We need to keep deciding things together. We need to give each other the time to breathe." Lucas watched the two sisters and felt an awareness of the net that held them. Family is a network of obligations and choices, of corrections and apologies. He began to see the ways his wealth created levers, and that those levers could be used or set aside. He deliberately set them aside more often. When a school needed a donated computer, he insisted they accept one anonymously, routed through a local co-op so the school would not be defined by a check. There were small victories that counted. Helena's first science fair, where she explained, proudly and slightly off-key, how she had built a small model of the solar system. Lucas sat in the back, listening as she mispronounced Jupiter, and then beamed when the teacher praised her ingenuity. Marina pressed his hand under the table. The gesture was private, but more binding than any public statement. Yet the largest test came in the form of an offer, a temptation that arrived cloaked as convenience. An acquaintance within Lucas's circle, someone with an eye for philanthropy and an appetite for social proof, offered to create a scholarship in Helena's name. The scholarship would be administered by Lucas's firm, showcased at a gala, and would include a photograph. Lucas presented with Helena and Marina as the face of a generous program. It would have given Marina resources, potentially raising Helena into opportunities. It would have also made their private negotiation into a public image. When the offer was floated in a casual lunch, Lucas felt an old current of thrill, the quick elevation of being both generous and newsworthy. He imagined a tidy charity structure that would fix practical things. Then he thought about the small meetings, about the way trust had been slow to knit itself. He thought of Helena's letter on his desk, and the way it had asked for a dad who stays, not for an annotated philanthropic line item. He declined the offer gently, citing privacy and the family's preference. The acquaintance nodded, unable to parse a refusal that would not be framed by headlines. Lucas felt a weight lift, as if a pocket of air had been released. "I admire that you can say no," Marina said when she learned of the offer. "Most would say yes. not because they are wicked, but because they see opportunity. He smiled, and for once his smile was without calculation. Because our story is not a campaign, he said, and I don't want Helena to think that being seen is the only way to be loved. That winter, another Christmas, circling like a patient comet, felt different. There was a promise in the air that had roots. They had not declared themselves a family with legal papers or grand announcements. They had, through dozens of small moments, decided to try. Lucas had learned the slow mathematics of care. Marina had allowed the space for him to grow into vulnerability without demanding miracles. Helena, who had once crumpled a letter and entrusted it to a stranger in a tower, had learned to be honest about what she wanted without weaponizing it. She wanted pancakes and a dad who stayed. She wanted unremarkable mornings and someone who would show up. The night before Christmas, Marina worked late, as she always did, preparing gifts with a thrift store savvy that was a kind of fine art. Lucas came early to help, to be part of the small logistics that make holidays feel like belonging. Stringing lights, wrapping presents, placing a small drawing by Helena's place setting that the child had made earlier, a crooked house with a star, inked with the same blunt hope that had first started everything. There was a small ceremonial air to his acting. He wrapped a present not as a spectacle, but as an ordinary person who wanted a hand in the ritual. He wrote a small note to both Marina and Helena and tucked it under a ribbon. He did not plan speeches or promises. He wanted the language of the moment to be truer than any rehearsal. That evening, they walked to Ibirapuera Park. The city had softened into a hush. Lights reflected on puddles from an earlier rain. Street vendors sold hot empanadas. Couples and families moved like constellations across the paths. They stopped by a bench where an old man played a soft melody on an accordion. Helena danced with shoes that made a small squeak, reveling in the small theatrics of street music. Back at Marina's apartment, the door opened to a living space filled with a small, familial warmth. The table was set with dishes that did not match, because nothing in this life was meant to be matched. It was made to fit. They ate with the comfortable awkwardness of people who had learned to share roofs and secrets. After dessert, an oversweet pudding that Helena insisted upon, they sat in a circle. Marina had a small envelope of her own. Lucas felt his stomach knot in a way he had once only felt in front of investors. Helena had made a tradition. Each year she selected one person to say what they were grateful for. This year she chose them both. "I'm grateful for warm pancakes," she began, careful with the grammar, "and for stars that don't go away, and for my mom who is like a wizard with money. And I'm grateful that someone came to stay who wants to learn pancakes." They all laughed. The room stretched in a small, satisfied silence. Then Marina looked at Lucas in a way that signaled a turning of the tide. She had been cautious, and even now she measured her words with a precision that carried weight. "You could leave," she said simply. "People do." He nodded. He knew. "I know." "Because there are other things," she continued, naming the pattern with an almost clinical calm. "There are companies that need you. There are offers that will sound clean and right. There are times when being loved must mean not fleeing to something else." He felt the truth of her words like a mirror. She had not asked him to be perfect. She had asked him to be present. He took a breath the way a man who had practiced small breaths before truth-telling does and leaned forward. The apartment felt smaller, in a way that meant intimacy, not pressure. "I will not pretend I can fix everything," he said. "I will not promise you a story that is printed for others. I will not make charity into spectacle. But I will tell you what I can promise." Marina waited. "I can promise that I will continue to be here, physically, by showing up when I say I will," he said. "I can promise to stop making decisions about you without asking. I can promise to be honest about when work demands me and to explain it clearly rather than hiding behind it. I can promise to keep my life private if you wish. And I can promise that I will try to be someone Helena knows she can count on. No flights, no hollow promises, just repetition. That's my promise."
It was not a grand speech of redemption. It was plain and measured. The confession had in it everything he had learned. That presence matters more than declaration. That continuity is the work of love. Marina's eyes softened in a way that felt like a translation of her own armor. She reached for his hand and squeezed it, letting him know this exchange was not merely rhetorical. "I want to believe you," she said, "but believing is not an event, it's a thing that grows." He nodded. "I know." There was more to say, fears to unpack, ways to define boundaries, ways to negotiate a path between his world and theirs. But they let the moment settle into a promise that was not legal but moral. It was a vow lived out in small acts rather than stamped in ink. They did not write contracts, they agreed on practices. No press, transparent choices, and an insistence upon private consent for any decision that affected the family. Helena, who had been listening with the seriousness of a juror, broke the moment with a child's sudden need for closure. "Can we open presents?" she demanded, wholly specific and joyfully impatient. The question had the power of a bell to call them back into ease. On Christmas morning, the apartment felt like a room that had been given the gift of ordinary daylight. There were small presents, an astronomy book with stickers, which Lucas had bought the day he skipped a meeting, a set of markers, a new jump rope. The framed drawing from Helena's first year together, her little crooked house with the glittering star, sat on the mantel. It had been framed by Lucas, a private act he had chosen because it felt right. He had not told Marina, he had simply done it. They gathered by the tiny tree and opened gifts with the kind of ceremonial slowness childhood teaches, the paper torn, the laugh when something unexpected appears, the sigh when a sweater is just the right color. When it was time for the little ritual, pancakes for breakfast, Lucas was there at the stove, flipping with a certain competence that had been earned in the small nights and mornings that had prefaced this one. Later, Helena presented Lucas with a card of her own making. Inside she had written with a child's shaky letters, "Dear Santa, please send me a dad who stays." She had added, below it, the new line she had practiced with loving accuracy, "Also, Lucas stays." She gave him the card with the unfiltered honesty of a child who once believed in miraculous interventions and now had a man who had chosen. He read the words and felt the letters circle closing in the most human way. The same plea on his desk months ago had set all this in motion. Now the petition was domestic, wrapped in aluminum foil and marker ink. It had been answered not by a miracle, but by a choice, and by the slow accumulation of small acts. Marina watched them, a private relief arranging itself into a smile. "I don't want promises," she said later, when the children were busy building a paper boat fleet in the sink. "I want to see you in the morning, and at the small things. I want to see you not run when things get hard." He bowed his head, understanding that the test would continue, that life would send future frays to test the rope they had woven. "I will be here," he said simply. "I will be present. I will make mistakes, and I will apologize." "You better," she said, with the rough affection of someone who will hold you accountable because you matter. The weeks after Christmas settled into a rhythm that felt less like novel narrative and more like a domesticated life. Neighborly coffees, Helena's school plays, the occasional board call that Lucas navigated without dramatics. There were small missteps, a postponed visit because of a late flight, a comment taken the wrong way. There were small recoveries, an apology left on the kitchen table, a bouquet of cheap supermarket flowers with a note that said, "Sorry, I'll do better." Those recoveries mattered. They were the stitches that made the seams resilient. Spring came again with the wild flirtation of jacaranda trees, and Lucas found himself the owner of a small framed drawing on his office wall. Helena's crooked house with the smudged star, preserved in a cheap frame he had bought at a flea market because he wanted it to be honest. People would remark on it sometimes in his office, "Ah, what a charming piece," but the meaning was private. It reminded him every day that the most consequential work he would do was not in shareholder reports, but in showing up.
Claudia, who had once been embarrassed by her attempt to control the narrative, became a trusted keeper of household privacy and an advocate of the slow work it takes for two worlds to combine without subtraction. She and Marina rebuilt a sisterly ritual, a monthly dinner where they traded recipes and jokes, negotiating the small challenges of family life. Rodrigo, who sometimes still teased Lucas about missing a meeting, became a companion who knew the measure of a man is not always the deals he closes, but sometimes the promises he keeps. The framed drawing of Helena's house eventually sat on a small shelf in Lucas's bedroom, a private liturgy. One evening, some months after their first Christmas together, he found himself writing, carefully, unspectacularly, a note to Marina. He left it on her kitchen table. Simple words, no flourish. "I won't be perfect," it read, "but I'm choosing to be here. Thank you for letting me learn how to hold this life with you." When Marina found it, she felt the quiet of being seen. She folded the note and put it in a jar with other small things, a ticket stub, a movie note, a receipt for a plant they had bought together. The jar was a collection of tiny evidence. Years from that first letter, people would talk about the anecdote. The billionaire who found a child's plea and was moved. Some would tell it as a neat parable. Others would use it to justify their own narratives about wealth and salvation. But inside a small apartment in Sao Paulo, the truth would be simpler and harder to convert to a press release. It would be a life made by repetition. A father figure who learned to make pancakes, a mother who allowed someone new into her calculations, and a child whose letter had become not a headline but a hinge. On a quiet afternoon, while Lucas and Helena were building a new fleet of paper boats and Marina brewed coffee, they framed the original letter once more. The paper had faded at the creases, the glitter dulled into a modest shimmer. They put it in a frame, not as a monument, but as a reminder of an honest beginning. Helena insisted that it be placed where the light would touch it in the morning, and so they sat the frame on a small bookshelf near the window, where the sunlight pooled and warmed it just so. Lucas looked at the letter and then at the two people who had, in equal measure, changed him. He felt no triumph, only gratitude and the steady work that true care requires. "Dear Santa, please send me a dad who stays," he whispered one morning, using the child's original plea. Helena's letter landed on a billionaire's desk, yes, but what it asked for was not money. It asked for time and staying, and that is what matters. Marina looked at him, and there was a quiet answer in her eyes. Helena ran in from the kitchen with a paper boat and declared, "We have a dad who stays." It was not a fairy tale with a neat final scene. It was a life they would guard with small, courageous acts. The letter that had arrived in a corner office had set a loose truth into motion. Presence over presence, repair over rescue, the humility of choosing to stay. Outside, Sao Paulo spread its complicated, beautiful sprawl, indifferent to narratives but always home to human ones. Inside, in a modest apartment warmed by a small tree of memories and the scent of pancakes, a family that had formed not by spectacle but by the patient accumulation of care gathered around a table and ate together, imperfect and present. And on the mantel, framed in a plain frame with a child's shaky handwriting and a stubborn star, the first letter rested as both artifact and promise. "Dear Santa, please send me a dad who stays." Her letter had indeed landed on a billionaire's desk. What followed was less sudden and more true. A man who learned that staying is a work that takes a lifetime, and a little girl who learned that asking is sometimes the bravest thing we can do.